You are listening to the Norton Library podcast, where we explore classic works of literature and philosophy with the leading scholars of the Norton Library, a new series from W.W. Norton that introduces influential texts to a new generation of readers. I'm your host, Mark Chirino, with Michael Von Cannon producing, and today we present part 2 of our interview devoted to F. Scott Fitzgerald's 1925 novel, The Great Gatsby, with its editor, Anne Margaret Daniel. In part 1, we discussed who Fitzgerald was and how The Great Gatsby came to be. And in this second episode, we examine the challenges of the novel, the common misconceptions, a playlist, and much more. Anne Margaret Daniel teaches literature at the New School University in New York City and has published widely on Fitzgerald, modernism, and music. Welcome, Anne Margaret.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be back.
So what first drew you to this book, and what continues to draw you to it as a scholar?
Oh my goodness, that is the biggest question of all. And in some ways the easiest question.
Do you remember when you first encountered it?
You know, I have a dim memory of when I first encountered it. That would have been at home in Richmond, Virginia. I was an only child, and my parents were both teachers. My mom is a retired biologist, and my father was an American history professor. And he had on his literature shelf, which were mostly those small Bantam paperbacks from the 1940s, he had a copy of The Great Gatsby with a sort of a lurid bluish cover, and it was crumbling, falling apart. He had written in the front, I think 1941 was the year that he had gotten it. And I paged through it, you know, without a real memory of reading it for the first time, but knowing that there were so many beautiful words and phrases in it that I remember vividly telling my father, I was probably about 7 or 8 years old, that I wanted a real copy of this book and not his crumbling little Bantam paperback, which I still have on my shelves, by the way. But he purchased me at that point the Scribner paperback with some nice notes in it. I believe they were by Matthew Broccoli at that point. And it had a brief introduction by Broccoli and kind of a reddish-brown cover with an image of Gatsby, inevitably a car behind him. And so that was my edition for a long time, the old Scribner paperback edition from the early 1960s. And then I bought myself a series of the Celestial Eyes cover, the paperback that has Francis Cugat's wonderful, wonderful artwork on the front of the eyes hovering over Coney Island in the most distinctive shade of blue. I think it was named certainly one of the most recognizable and one of the best known covers of any book in history.
Which I think the Norton Library pays homage to with your gorgeous blue and yellow cover on your edition.
Yeah, I'm all in favor of any sort of homage to that 1925 first edition, which is just a magnificent, magnificent book. And
so how did you become a Fitzgerald scholar?
I went to Princeton. And
that'll do it.
That's actually the truth. I read Fitzgerald, of course, in high school and in college. I remember vividly the first Thanksgiving that I came home to Virginia from Massachusetts. I read Tender as the Night for the first time on the train on the way home. And I was dissolved in tears when I got home to Virginia. And, you know, my parents came to pick me up at the station, and I was just weeping my way into the car, having spent the entire time down from Massachusetts reading Tender as the Night for the first time. I got to Princeton as a graduate student after a brief detour into the law. I was a litigator for a few years, and I came there to study 18th century literature. However, when I arrived, somewhat fortuitously, the entire 18th century department had either taken jobs elsewhere or retired. So I literally had no one to work with. And my second favorite time period had always been modernism. And I was lucky enough to be taken under the wing of one of the 20th century's leading modern scholars, a gentleman named A. Walton Litz, who had been at Princeton for many years, a very prominent scholar of James Joyce. He was one of the first people to work on Finnegan's Wake, of T.S. Eliot, Yeats, Ezra Pound, Fitzgerald, and Faulkner. Hemingway less so. He never really liked Hemingway that much. And I took his James Joyce seminar as a first-year graduate student. And when I was looking for an independent study for the spring term, he physically marched me over to the library, took me into the rare books room, and said, "The Fitzgerald papers take up hundreds and hundreds of boxes. Scholars have been going through them since the 1950s, and you will find many things here that nobody has ever seen before. That will continue to be true for decades. Get to work." And that was literally my introduction to it. The more I read in the Fitzgerald papers, the more newspaper clippings I found that he had written marginalia on, the more drafts of his I looked at, the more appreciation I gained for him as an absolutely gifted professional writer. There's a very wrong view of Fitzgerald out there as a kind of a beautiful blonde young man who is effortlessly, writing graceful short stories and novels with one hand while drinking a martini with the other. That couldn't be farther from the truth. He labored over what he wrote. He agonized, he revised, he redrafted. The manuscript drafts for Gatsby that survive are tremendous to read. It's important to see everything he left out to let you know how good what he put in actually is. And it was as a graduate student, now 30 years ago, that I became a Fitzgerald scholar and have had what I consider the honor to be one since.
In your introduction to The Great Gatsby and your work on Gatsby, you acknowledge how iconic the novel is and how popular it is, how many people have read it and teach it and learn it. Is there a common misreading of The Great Gatsby? Is there something that you think a lot of people get wrong about the novel?
There's so much in it that it's hard to say that something another person finds there is wrong. I think a common misreading, though, the most common misreading, is that it is a grand romance and love story. Well, yes, it is, in a way, but it is also a very dark, frightening novel where this so-called love story is a man's almost entirely misplaced passion and false construction of a young woman he never really knew during the course of a brief, weeks-long romance. It's a story of adultery. That grand romance is definitionally an adultery. And it's a story in which one of the two lovers permits the partner to be executed for vehicular manslaughter that she has actually committed. I don't really see the grand romance in that. So, to say people have a love like Daisy and Gatsby is to say no thanks.
Yeah. Anne Margaret, I know we talked about a couple of lines on our first episode that are important to your reading. Do you have a favorite line in The Great Gatsby?
I do. My favorite line in The Great Gatsby, that's not on the last page, which I have memorized by heart and which I love every single word of, including that orgiastic.
We will talk about that, sure.
My favorite line in The Great Gatsby is the silver pepper of the stars.
Mm.
It's at the ending of that chapter where Nick is outside on his lawn and he's looking out at the Sound, and he noticed that somebody is there. It's after he's come back from the party, after he's come back from his luncheon and introduced us to all these characters. He realizes he's not alone, is what he says. And he sees that it's he assumes it's Mr. Gatsby, his neighbor, seeing what is his share of the local heavens. But that one phrase that's embedded in this long description of Gatsby reaching toward the green light, which is what everyone focuses on. And then suddenly the last line is, he's alone in the unquiet darkness, which also is gorgeous. There are just so many phrases on that page, but the one that stays in my heart is the silver pepper of the stars. It's just, nobody could have written that description but Fitzgerald. And I've never looked at a starry night since without thinking of silver pepper, and I never will.
That is a beautiful moment. That is page 20 of your edition at the very end of chapter 1. I'm sure you've taught The Great Gatsby dozens and dozens and dozens of times. What technique or techniques do you rely on in order to teach The Great Gatsby?
Oh, goodness. Well, I have to say Fitzgerald is a great help there. He doesn't really require a lot of technique. He just requires people who enjoy reading beautiful language. And in an English class, even one that, let's say, students are taking because it's a requirement, you get people who are at least interested in literary studies, and that's the reason they're taking it for a requirement. The language is the biggest help in terms of technique. Just letting people, I say, just pretend you're swimming. Just get in there and swim with the words. There is such great beauty in the way he's putting together the phrases. And a lot of students really like what they call the poetical language of The Great Gatsby. I find particularly these days, a lot of students who are afraid of poetry, who don't like reading particularly modern poetry, who haven't learned in high school and grade school the way it was taught once upon a time, things like scansion, things like poetic form, how to talk about sonnets, epic poetry. And they're nervous of poetry, but Fitzgerald interestingly leads a lot of students into reading poetry, into being interested in modern poetry, Keats, Shelley, the Romantics, the poets that he particularly liked. I've had that happen when I've taught Gatsby, and students going back to the 1920s song lyrics that he puts in and wanting to know more about. Particularly, Gatsby leads students into a kind of a cultural exploration of the years right after the end of World War I and the beginning of the Jazz Age that they find very interesting and compelling, because there's just so much about popular culture in the book. A colleague of mine who was a graduate student at Princeton when I was, a woman named Sarah Churchwell, has written a pretty magnificent book called Careless People that includes a lot of the cultural setting and history and newspaper columns and this kind of thing that inform the construction of The Great Gatsby. So, and that's all coming from Fitzgerald himself. He's a fantastic help. He kept scrapbooks of every novel he wrote, and scrapbook number 5 in the Princeton collection, now available online, is his own scrapbook of The Great Gatsby. Letters he got from people, talking about it, critical reviews that he saved, mentions in newspapers. I direct students to that to see what the contemporary reception was. And I find that really helpful. A lot of them have read The Great Gatsby or been given it in high school without very much background or information, and it puts them off. So that's a way that I use to kind of induce them to come back to it and not sort of throw up their hands and say, oh, I'm not going to read this again. I read it once before. Every time you read that novel, it's so protean. It changes. It changes when you're 20. It changes when you're 25. Boy, when you get to be 30 and 35, Nick Carraway's decade of thinning ranks of single men, thinning hair, a thinning briefcase of new experiences, man, does it change again.
Yeah. Are there adaptations that you recommend, that you do recommend and don't recommend?
Um, yes, and yes. I really wish that 1926 movie version starring Warner Baxter had survived. That would be fascinating. All we have is a trailer for that. And I found in Zelda's papers, which are also at Princeton, her letter to Scotty and Scotty's nanny when she and Scott had gone to Hollywood in 1927. They went and saw the movie version, and she said it's rotten in capital letters. It's rotten and awful and terrible, and we left. So they walked out of the theater. But the trailer shows to me some really interesting things, like there's a bit of the party scene with the pool and somebody throwing a handful of coins, and I think that really captures the Trimalchio experience that Fitzgerald was thinking of. The Alan Ladd film version, which is the next one made, the kind of the film noir Gatsby, is horrible, despite the performance of an excellent Ruth Hussey as Jordan Baker. They just tamper too much with the plot. It's really poorly done. The Redford version, the Redford Mia Farrow version with a very young Sam Waterston as Nick Carraway, and an absolutely spot on excellent Karen Black as Myrtle Wilson. She's the best Myrtle Wilson there'll ever be. That is just the most gorgeous movie you could imagine, and it's easy on the eyes. And Redford captures, I think, perfectly the spaciousness of Gatsby, the way in which Gatsby is a big blank screen onto which other people project their fantasies, their desires, their fears. Redford kind of lent himself to that throughout his whole movie career, and he doesn't do it anywhere so perfectly as he does in The Great Gatsby. There's a version with Toby Steven, a made-for-TV version that's interesting in some ways. I believe I'm correct that Paul Rudd is Nick Carraway in that, and he's always great.
Mira Sorvino as Daisy, yeah,
and Mira Sorvino as Daisy. Wonderful cast. Kind of thinly done. The flashbacks are terrible. The flashback scenes are terrible, but Toby Steven is a superb actor, and he gets some of Gatsby's pettiness, I think, really well. The Lerman version, the Son et Lumière Gatsby, I was actually a consultant on that, so I'm proud of many things about that, not least the way Lerman, he captured the energy and the possibility of the time period. I think Tobey Maguire is great as Nick Carraway. He's sort of baffled and wide-eyed a lot of the time, maybe a little too much of the time. DiCaprio captures Gatsby's anger and frustration like no other actor I've seen. Carey Mulligan worked really hard on the role. She actually came to Princeton, talked with some of the librarians, looked at some items in the Fitzgerald papers, read Jim West's book about Ginevra King, Perfect Hour, and did her homework on the role, as did DiCaprio. He was really interested. I think it's important for people to know he was really interested in Gatsby as a kind of an American Hamlet, as a tragic hero upon whom circumstances are acting. And I think he took some of his very good performance and the anger in that performance from that idea. I welcome all the adaptations of Gatsby that get made in the future. Hollywood can't lay off it. And in some ways, it's a doomed project because Fitzgerald's language has already done all the work of a cinematographer, a narrator, an actor delivering the lines, and Fitzgerald's hard to top. Indeed, impossible.
Well, if you were a consultant on the Luhrmann movie, perhaps you've already answered this question in some way, but what song or songs would you put on a Gatsby playlist?
Oh, goodness. Well, I would put the ones from the book itself, In the Morning, In the Evening, Ain't We Got Fun, the songs that are actually used, 3 o'clock in the morning, that little waltz, songs that actually occur in the book.
Beale
What
Street
else would I?
Blues, right? Beale Street Blues.
Absolutely, lots of blues, lots of jazz, lots of Gershwin. But I really like, again, the energy in Lerman using contemporary music in having basically a playlist, I believe was curated by Jay-Z,
Yeah.
that uses the music of today to energize a story that was told back then. I don't think that's wrong. I've always been a fan of things like the old Shenandoah Shakespeare Express theater company, where you have a group of basically high school and college age actors in Chuck Taylors and jeans and white t-shirts performing Shakespeare. I think costumes and music can be traded to fit. I think there should be a new version of Gatsby made that's set in the present day, about every 20 or 30 years, as American history lurches on and as American culture dips into new lows and highs. I think that would be a fascinating project, kind of like a 7-Up, but for Gatsby.
And Margaret, we are also asking our Norton Library editors for a hot take on their books that they have edited. Do you have something controversial to say about Gatsby?
My hot take on Gatsby is that Myrtle Wilson is a much more significant and a much more interesting character than people give her credit for being. I mentioned earlier Karen Black's performance. When Karen Black was doing her makeup for her death scene, spoiler, she insisted that the corners of her mouth be ripped, because that's a line straight out of the text. And Fitzgerald was very worried about Myrtle's death scene. He wanted the line about the fact that her left breast had been torn loose and swung like a flap. There was no need to listen for the heart underneath. He wrote to Max Perkins and said, "Look, I know this is raw. I know this is awful, but this is what happens when a car hits somebody. I want it in there." I mean, he held his line on that. And that particular artistic interpretation, Karen Black hadn't read that letter, but she got Fitzgerald right. And she insisted on that in the filming. You know, Hollywood's like, "Oh, let's make it pretty, let's wrap her in a blanket." And she said, "No, there has to be a lot of blood."
That is an excellent take. 2 questions about the novel itself, about 2 famous aspects of the novel itself. The first is, do you believe that you can repeat the past?
No.
Can you explain what the nature of the argument is that Nick and Gatsby have? Can you say a few things about why do they have such a fundamental disagreement about whether or not we can repeat the past?
Well, that was a quick answer, because no, technically we can't repeat the past. We physically can't. But think about all the constructions in society going back over the centuries and centuries of human history where people want to repeat the past. Oh, if I could go back and do it again. Think about the popularity of something like Doctor Who, where you can go back in a TARDIS and you can revisit the past. But one of the big rules about Doctor Who is that you can never tamper with it. You can't change history.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Doctor Who changes history all the time. But the desire to go back and do that, think about that old episode of Star Trek where the characters go back and Dr. McCoy falls in love with a young woman who's running the peace movement. And if she's not allowed to be hit by a car, then, the course of World War II will be radically changed and Hitler will win and the world will be destroyed. So this young woman has to die. We want to go back and repeat the past. We want to make up for our own mistakes. We want to get things right. It's a very human desire to want to do that.
Is it silly or romantic for Gatsby to believe that?
Both. It's both silly and romantic for Gatsby to believe that. First of all, the past wasn't so great. If he goes back to those days in Louisville, he will be once again a poor young man with just the uniform on his back. he wants to go back and he wants to marry Daisy out of her family home in Louisville, just as if it were 5+ years ago. She is, a quickly maturing woman based on her physical descriptions in the book, which are limited, but she's got a baby. She has a little girl. She's a wife and a mother. Nothing will be the same as it was again. You can't repeat the past in this context. What Gatsby wants to do is go back, and I think in T.S. Eliot's phrase, what he wants to do rather than repeat the past is redeem the time. That amazing, amazing phrase of T.S. Eliot's. He wants to redeem the time.
That is beautiful. So, Anne Margaret, you alluded to your infatuation with the last page of this novel, which has to be one of the great closings of any American novel. What is so magical about how Fitzgerald ends The Great Gatsby?
It's the lead in. He takes you by surprise, I think. He talks about the big shore places being closed now. There were hardly any lights except the shadowy moving glow of a ferry boat across the sound. Right? The setting that he gives you is the setting that you've been accustomed to. You've been to the parties. You've seen these big shore houses. It's the end of summer. Autumn is coming. It's a time when places like this were still being closed up, when people still had summer houses that they closed. It's a building elegiac feeling. And slowly he brings the focus out. Nick is looking up at the moon, and the moon rises higher, as it will, coming up as the world spins. He says the inessential houses began to melt away until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes. And suddenly, with that kaleidoscopic fade back, and it's very cinematic, it's the camera pulling back, right? It's as if he's zooming back. You can suddenly see you're also peeling back the pages of history. You're fading back into what it looked like when the first ships from Amsterdam came to New Amsterdam, and those Dutch sailors of the late 1500s, early 1600s were looking at this fresh green breast of the new world, where now there are the spires and towers of Manhattan Island, right, and Long Island. Then he talks about all human dreams and the standing in front of this continent, this brand new continent, this newfound land. And he says that's the last time in human history that there's something commensurate to our capacity for wonder. I would love to know what Fitzgerald would have thought of travel to the moon. If he had, let's say he'd lived to be in his 90s, as some do, I would have heard him talk at the 92nd Street Y when I was in college. It would have been possible. And he would have made a comment on the moon landing.
That's right.
I wonder if it would have been that same capacity for wonder. Then he shifts the focus again to zoom in on Gatsby and the green light at the end of Daisy's dock, which was originally 2 green lights. He had it set up for 2 lights in one of the drafts, and then he crossed it out mercifully and just made it 1. And somehow he makes the transition in 3 sentences from Gatsby standing at the end of the dock to that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. I can hardly read that without gasping, as you just heard. That's all of American history and settlement, or rather all the good and beautiful things about it, in one line, right? That if he had used any word other than the Republic, if he had said the country, if he had just said the country, it would have been flatter. It wouldn't have had the political and emotional valence that he just nailed in that. And then I've always loved the boats against the current. borne back ceaselessly into the past. That's our memory. That's the trajectory of our memory. That is the act of repeating the past. We can only do it in our mind. And we're always going to be boats against the current in trying, right? Because you can never get but so far without being, without being pushed back through the very act of your trying to remember. It reminds me of lines that Toni Morrison uses in Beloved, talking about rememory. That's what's going on here. Fitzgerald didn't have the word for it yet. Morrison coined it. Morrison, who is a huge fan of Fitzgerald's and of Faulkner's, the idea of rememory in describing history and time and space, but that eluded us. The fact that he makes it a collective, it didn't elude them. Yeah. It didn't elude Gatsby. It eluded us. You're standing there too. You're included. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms further, and one fine morning. And then with that dash, he could have ended the novel there with that dash and just left it open. But instead, he returns to the boats, to the lines that are actually on his own gravestone in the cemetery in Rockville. It literally is breathtaking to read those lines. They encompass so much on both the individual and the national spiritual level. It's a deeply, intensely American novel. To my mind, it is the great American novel.
I wonder if you look around at our current society and the way America currently is, and can make some sort of a judgment about how The Great Gatsby can be read today in a way that might be different than 1925. How does it speak to our current situation?
Honestly, I think it speaks to our current situation in the same way. It's a cautionary tale. It is beautiful, it's lyrical, but it's also a cautionary tale. And it was in 1925. One of the reasons I think that it wasn't as popular in 1925 as Fitzgerald hoped it would be is because they're in the heart of the jazz age and the boom accompanying it. He was already predicting the crash of 1929. I mean, you close the cover of that novel feeling like the crash has already come. This Bond business has already, gone. Yeah. Just the way of Gatsby's inflatable mattress. And I think that it should and can be read as a cautionary tale today. He's not celebrating the wealth and the flash and the dash and the fizz. He's warning us about putting our hearts and minds and futures into that, into something unsubstantiated and insubstantiatable. Gatsby is in many ways, and that last page just is redolent of it. It's a caution to get back to your roots and to remain rooted lest you lose everything when the crash comes, because it will. That's how I read it, at least.
Anne Margaret Daniel, thank you so much for joining us on the Norton Library podcast and talking about your wonderful edition of F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
The Norton Library edition of The Great Gatsby, edited by Anne Margaret Daniel, is available now in paperback and ebook. Check out the links in the description to this episode for ordering options and more information about the Norton Library, including the full catalog of titles. I'm Mark Chirino with Michael Von Cannon, and this is the Norton Library Podcast.